Picture this, the dusty trails of 1880s America, where a single piece of paper could change 2 lives forever. In a world where communication traveled by horseback and hope was measured in miles, sometimes the greatest love stories began with the smallest mistakes. Today, I'm going to tell you about Sarah Mitchell and Thomas Brennan, 2 souls who discovered that fate has a peculiar way of delivering exactly what we need, even when we think we're looking for something else entirely. But before we dive into this incredible tale of accidental love, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss the stories coming your way. Now let's step back in time to a moment when a simple mistake became the beginning of everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden planks of Millbrook's general store as Sarah Mitchell carefully folded the letter for the 3rd time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the October chill seeping through the gaps in the walls, but from the vulnerability she'd poured onto those pages. 3 months of stolen glances, shared conversations after Sunday service, and the growing certainty that James Crawford was the man she wanted to spend her life with had culminated in this moment. "Just drop it off at the Crawford place," she whispered to herself, smoothing down her brown wool dress. "What's the worst that could happen?" Sarah had been the town's schoolteacher for 2 years now, ever since arriving from Boston after her father's passing. At 26, she was considered by many to be approaching spinsterhood, but she'd never felt the urgency others seemed to think she should. That was until James Crawford started lingering after church services, asking about her students and sharing stories about his work at the bank. The letter felt heavy in her hands as she made her way to the post office. Inside, old Pete Morrison was sorting through the morning mail, his weathered fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Morning, Miss Mitchell," he called out without looking up. "What can I do for you today?" "I need this delivered to the Crawford place, please," Sarah said, placing the letter on the wooden counter. Pete glanced up, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Crawford, you say?" "That'd be the old Crawford homestead out past Miller's Creek, right? Been empty since old Henry passed last spring." Sarah's heart skipped. "No, I mean James Crawford. He lives in town, above the bank." "Ah, young James!" Pete chuckled. "Well, why didn't you say so? Though I should mention, he left yesterday for Denver. Banking business," he said. "Won't be back for 2 weeks. The disappointment must have shown on Sarah's face, because Pete leaned forward conspiratorially. "You know, if it's urgent, I could have young Billy ride it out to the old Crawford place. Thomas Brennan's been working that land since Henry died. Distant cousin or some such? Keeps to himself mostly, but he might know how to reach James." Sarah hesitated. The letter was deeply personal, her heart laid bare in careful script. But the thought of waiting 2 more weeks, of losing her courage entirely, made her nod. "Yes, please." "That would be wonderful." Pete scribbled something on the envelope and tossed it into the outgoing mail bag. "Billy'll have it there by afternoon." As Sarah walked back toward the schoolhouse, she felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The letter was sent. Whatever happened now was out of her hands. Thomas Brennan had been mending fence posts when young Billy Morrison came riding up the dusty trail to his homestead. The boy couldn't have been more than 14, all elbows and enthusiasm, and he was holding an envelope like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Letter for you, Mr. Brennan," Billy called out, dismounting with the graceless energy of youth. Thomas wiped his hands on his worn denim pants and accepted the envelope with surprise. Mail was rare out here. Most folks in town barely acknowledged his existence, let alone wrote to him. He'd been working Henry Crawford's old land for 6 months now, trying to bring it back to life, but the isolation suited him fine. After what had happened in Colorado, Solitude felt like a blessing rather than a curse. The envelope was addressed in elegant, feminine handwriting, and for a moment Thomas's heart clenched with an old familiar pain. It had been 3 years since Margaret's death, 3 years since he'd received a letter written in a woman's careful script. He'd almost handed it back to Billy, but something made him hesitate. "You sure this is for me?" he asked. "Says Crawford Place right there," Billy pointed out. "And you're the only one living here now." After Billy rode away, Thomas sat on his porch steps and stared at the envelope for a long time. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Finally, with hands that weren't quite steady, he opened it. "My dearest James, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about our conversations after church, and I find myself looking forward to Sunday services in a way I never have before. There's something about the way you listen, really listen, when I talk, about my students or my dreams for the future that makes me feel seen in a way I haven't experienced since leaving Boston. I know this is forward of me, and perhaps improper, but I can't shake the feeling that we're meant for something more than polite conversation and stolen glances. When you smile at me across the church pew, my heart does things I didn't know hearts could do. When you asked about my favorite book last Sunday and then mentioned you'd read it too, I felt a connection I've been searching for my entire life. I'm writing this because I believe in honesty, even when it's terrifying. I believe I'm falling in love with you, James, not with the idea of you, or with the security you might represent, but with the man who remembers that I take my coffee with honey instead of sugar, who asks about little Emma's progress with her reading, who looks at me like I'm something precious and rare. If you feel even a fraction of what I'm feeling, I would be honored to explore where this path might lead us. If not, I hope we can remain friends, though I confess my heart might need some time to heal. With all my affection and hope, Sarah. Thomas read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Someone named Sarah was in love with someone named James, and somehow this intimate, beautiful declaration had ended up in his hands. He should return it immediately, of course. This was clearly a mistake, a misdirected piece of mail that belonged to someone else. But as he read it a 4th time, something unexpected happened. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years began to crack, just a little. Here was a woman who wrote about love with such honesty, such courage. A woman who believed in taking chances, in speaking truth even when it was frightening. Margaret had been like that once, bold and honest, and unafraid of her own heart. Thomas folded the letter carefully and went inside his small cabin. He lit the oil lamp and sat at his rough wooden table, staring at the blank paper he used for keeping ranch records. For the first time in 3 years, he wanted to write something that wasn't about cattle counts or fence repairs. The response he penned was simple. "Dear Sarah, your letter found me, and I want you to know I love you too. Thomas Brennan, Crawford Homestead." He sealed it before he could change his mind and rode into town the next morning to post it himself. Sarah stared at the brief response in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The handwriting was different, bolder, more angular than James's careful script, and the signature made no sense at all. "Thomas Brennan?" she whispered to herself, sitting in her small room above the schoolhouse. "Who is Thomas Brennan?" She read the letter again, hoping for some clue, some explanation. But there were only those 7 words. "Your letter found me, and I want you to know I love you too." The rational part of her mind knew this had to be a mistake. Perhaps this Thomas person was a friend of James's, someone who was forwarding messages. But the way he'd written "I love you too," There was something so direct about it, so personal, that it didn't feel like a messenger's words. Sarah spent a sleepless night wrestling with confusion and an emotion she couldn't quite name. By morning, she'd made her decision. She would ride out to the Crawford homestead and sort this out in person. If nothing else, she could retrieve her original letter and try to forget this whole embarrassing episode. The ride to the homestead took most of the morning. Sarah had borrowed Mrs. Henderson's mare, promising to have her back by evening. As she followed the winding trail past Miller's Creek, the landscape opened up into rolling hills, dotted with oak trees, just beginning to turn autumn colors. It was beautiful country, wild and open, in a way that made her chest feel tight, with something between longing and fear. The Crawford homestead sat in a natural valley, protected from the worst of the prairie winds by a stand of cottonwoods. Sarah could see smoke rising from the chimney of a modest log cabin, and there were signs of recent work everywhere: new fence posts, a repaired barn roof, a vegetable garden that had been carefully tended. As she approached the cabin, a man emerged from the barn. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting, and clothes that spoke of hard work rather than fashion. When he saw her, he stopped dead in his tracks, and even from a distance Sarah could see the surprise on his face. She dismounted near the porch, her legs unsteady from both the long ride and her nervousness. The man approached slowly, as if she might bolt at any sudden movement. "You must be Sarah," he said, and his voice was deeper than she'd expected. "Roughened by years of calling to cattle across open range. And you're Thomas Brennan," she replied, studying his face. He was handsome in a weathered way, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind. But there was something else there too, a sadness that seemed to live in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself. "I am." He gestured toward the porch. "Would you like to sit? I imagine you have questions." Sarah nodded, settling herself on the wooden steps, while Thomas sat a respectful distance away. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was filled with the sound of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant lowing of cattle. "I wrote that letter for James Crawford," Sarah said finally. "I don't understand how it ended up with you, or why you responded the way you did." Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. James Crawford was Henry's nephew. He inherited this place when Henry died, but he never wanted to work the land. Hired me to manage it while he stayed in town with his banking job. Thomas picked up a piece of grass and twisted it between his fingers. "Your letter was addressed to the Crawford place. Postman figured it was meant for whoever was living here. But your response?" Sarah's voice trailed off. "Was a mistake," Thomas said quietly. "I should have returned your letter immediately. Should have explained the confusion. But when I read it—" He looked up at her then, and Sarah saw something raw and honest in his dark eyes. It had been a long time since anyone had written to me about love. A long time since I'd felt anything but empty. Sarah felt her breath catch. "You're married." "Was." The word came out flat, final. "My wife Margaret died 3 years ago. Fever took her and our unborn child both." He was quiet for a moment, then continued. "I came here to start over, to see if I could build something new from the ashes of what I'd lost. Your letter. It reminded me that maybe I wasn't as dead inside as I thought." The honesty in his voice made Sarah's chest tight. She thought about the careful way he'd written "I love you too," not as a declaration to her, but as an acknowledgement of the possibility of love itself. "I should go," she said, starting to rise. "This was all a misunderstanding. I'm sorry for intruding on your grief." "Wait." Thomas stood as well, and when Sarah looked at him, she saw something she hadn't expected. Hope. Would you like to see the place? Since you rode all this way. Sarah knew she should decline, should ride back to town and try to forget this strange encounter. But something in Thomas's expression, the careful way he was trying not to seem too eager, made her nod. "I'd like that," she said. Thomas showed Sarah around the homestead with the quiet pride of a man who'd built something with his own hands. He pointed out the new fence line he'd constructed, the barn roof he'd repaired after the spring storms, the small herd of cattle he was raising. As they walked, Sarah found herself drawn not just to the improvements he'd made, but to the way he talked about the land with respect and affection, and if it were a living thing that deserved care. "Margaret always wanted a place like this," he said, as they stood looking out over the pasture where his cattle grazed. "She grew up in the city, but she dreamed of wide-open spaces and a garden where she could grow her own vegetables." He gestured toward the neat rows of late-season crops near the cabin. "I planted that for her, in a way. Seemed like the right thing to do." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, not the giddy excitement she'd felt when thinking about James, but something deeper and more complex. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman." She was. Thomas turned to look at Sarah, and she was surprised to see that his expression wasn't entirely sad. "She also would have boxed my ears for wallowing in grief. For 3 years, instead of living the life she died wanting us to have." They made their way back to the cabin as the afternoon sun began to slant lower in the sky. Thomas invited Sarah inside for coffee, and she found herself accepting, despite knowing she should start the ride back to town. The cabin was simple but clean, with handmade furniture and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. What struck Sarah most was how lived-in it felt, not like the home of a man who was merely existing, but of someone who was building a life. "I have a confession," Thomas said as he poured coffee into 2 mismatched cups. "I've seen you before. In town, I mean. You probably don't remember, but I was there the day you arrived, 2 years ago. You were standing outside the schoolhouse with your trunk and your carpet bag, looking like you weren't sure if you'd made a terrible mistake or the best decision of your life." Sarah accepted the coffee, surprised by the admission. "I don't remember seeing you. Most folks don't notice me much," Thomas said with a slight smile. "I prefer it that way usually, but I noticed you. The way you squared your shoulders before walking into that schoolhouse, like you were gathering courage. I thought you looked like someone who understood what it meant to start over." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping coffee and listening to the fire crackle in the hearth. Sarah found herself studying Thomas's face in the firelight, noting the way his expression softened when he wasn't guarding himself so carefully. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. Thomas nodded. "When you wrote back to me, when you said you loved me too, what did you mean?" Thomas set down his coffee cup and was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, careful. "I meant that I recognized something in your letter. The courage it took to write it, the hope you were willing to risk. I meant that reading about your kind of love, honest and brave and real, reminded me that I wanted to feel that way again someday." He looked at her directly. "I didn't mean that I loved you, Sarah. I don't know you well enough for that. But I meant that I loved the possibility of you, of us, of whatever this might become, if we're both brave enough to find out." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, though she couldn't say exactly why. "That's the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me. Margaret always said honesty was the only foundation worth building on," Thomas replied. "Everything else is just pretty decoration that falls down in the first strong wind." As the sun began to set, Sarah knew she needed to start back to town. But as she prepared to leave, Thomas caught her hand gently. Would you consider coming back?" he asked. "Not because of any mistake or misdelivered letter, but because you want to. I'd like to know you, Sarah, the real you, not just the woman who wrote that beautiful letter." Sarah looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected to find. Not the passionate romance she'd imagined with James, but something steadier and deeper. The possibility of a love built on understanding rather than fantasy, on shared hopes rather than shared loneliness. "I'd like that too," she said. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself making the ride to the Crawford homestead every Sunday after church. She and Thomas would walk the property, sharing stories about their pasts and their dreams for the future. She learned that he'd been a teacher himself before marrying Margaret, that he'd always wanted to try his hand at ranching, that he read poetry by lamplight, and could make bread that rivaled anything from the town bakery. Thomas learned that Sarah had come west, not just because of her father's death, but because she'd wanted to prove to herself that she could build a life on her own terms, that she loved teaching, but sometimes dreamed of having children of her own to raise alongside her students, that she was stronger than her quiet demeanor suggested, and funnier than anyone in town had ever bothered to discover. By Christmas, when Thomas asked Sarah to marry him, it felt less like a proposal than a recognition of something that had already grown between them. They were married in the spring, in the small church where Sarah had once watched James Crawford and wondered if he might be her future. As Sarah stood at the altar in her mother's wedding dress, looking into Thomas's eyes, she thought about the letter that had started it all, the mistake that hadn't been a mistake at all, but fate's way of delivering exactly what she needed when she was brave enough to reach for what she wanted. Years later, when their children asked how their parents had met, Sarah and Thomas would tell them about the letter that found its way home, about how sometimes the best love stories begin not with love at first sight, but with the courage to be honest about what your heart wants, even when you're not sure where that honesty might lead. And in the evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done, Sarah would sometimes find Thomas reading by lamplight, and she would remember the man who had responded to a stranger's declaration of love with 7 simple words that changed everything. "Your letter found me, and I want you to know I love you too." And that's how a simple mistake became the foundation of a love that lasted a lifetime. Sarah and Thomas built their ranch into one of the most successful in the territory, raised 4 children who grew up understanding that the best things in life often come from the courage to be vulnerable, and proved that sometimes fate has a better plan than the one we make for ourselves. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell, because love stories like this one remind us that the most beautiful chapters of our lives often begin with the smallest acts of courage. Until next time, keep believing in the power of an honest heart and the magic of unexpected beginnings.